At some point today, you closed a door. Maybe you didn't think about it. Maybe you were just going to the bathroom or taking a call, or you wanted 20 minutes where nobody could see your face. That door is the single most underrated piece of technology in your entire life. And for almost everyone who has ever lived, it did not exist. Now here's the part that should bother you a little. The people who built the most famous tombs on the planet, the ones who carved the Valley of the Kings out of solid rock with copper chisels and unbelievable patience, went home at the end of the day to a house with no interior doors at all. No bedroom, no bathroom, no hallway, 4 rooms in a straight line, shared walls on both sides, a staircase to the roof, and roughly 10 people inside it. You did not have a room. Nobody had a room. Rooms, as a concept, were for gods and dead kings. So what did they actually do? Where did they sleep? Where did they fight? Where did they have sex? Where did they cry? And what happens to a human being who is never, not once in their entire life, unobserved? The answer involves beds on rooftops, a sex scandal that somebody filed in writing, a god who settled property disputes in the middle of the street, and about 50,000 pieces of garbage that turned out to be the most intimate archive in the ancient world. Let's go. Here's the thing nobody tells you about privacy. You probably assume ancient people wanted it the same way you want it, and simply couldn't afford it. That they were standing there in their crowded little houses thinking, God, I wish I had a room. That privacy is a human need, and history is just the story of us slowly getting enough money to buy it. That's backwards. The wanting came later. For most of human history, being alone was not a treat. It was a warning sign. Being alone meant you had been cast out, or you were sick, or you were up to something. The Egyptians didn't have a word that maps cleanly onto what we mean by privacy. And it's not because their language was primitive, it's because the thing we're describing wasn't a category to them. You were a household. You were a street. You were a work crew. The individual, sealed off, unobservable, doing whatever they like behind a locked door is a fairly recent invention, and it is significantly weirder than you think. And here's the second thing. We know all of this in absurd, embarrassing, sometimes heartbreaking detail because of one specific village, which I need to explain before anything else makes sense. Ancient Egypt is 3,000 years long. That's not a civilization, that's a geological era with a bureaucracy. And most of what survives from it is the stuff that was built to survive, which means temples, tombs, and enormous stone monuments to men who really wanted you to know their name. Palaces were mud brick. Houses were mud brick. Mud brick returns to mud, which means for most of Egyptian history, we have spectacular evidence of how they died, and almost nothing about how they lived, except in one place. On the West Bank at Thebes, tucked into a dry desert valley between the cliffs and the cultivated land, there's a village called Deir el-Medina. It was founded around 1500 BCE in the reign of Thutmose I, and it was occupied for something like 450 years. It was purpose-built housing for the crew that cut and decorated the royal tombs. Roughly 70 houses packed inside a mud brick enclosure wall with one main gate. A company town in the desert. And here's the crucial part. It was too dry for anything to rot. It was walled so the rubbish stayed put, and the people living there were unusually literate for their time because their entire job was carving and painting text, so they wrote things down, constantly, and then they threw the writing away, and the desert kept every single piece of it, which means we know more about the daily lives of the 60-odd families in this one dusty village than we know about almost any other ordinary community in the entire ancient world. We know who owed who what. We know who was sleeping with who. We know who called in sick and why. Hold that thought because it's going to come back at the end and it's going to hit harder than you expect. First, the house. Let's walk through it, because the architecture is the whole story. A standard Deir el-Medina house is a narrow rectangle, roughly 70 square meters, and it shares its long walls with the houses on either side. Terraced housing, 3,500 years before anyone built a terrace in England. You enter from the street directly into the first room. Not a hall, not an entryway, the room. Your front door opens into your family's life at full volume. Then you step down or through into the main room, which usually has a wooden column holding up a higher ceiling, a low mud brick bench built against the wall, and a small niche for household gods. Behind that, a smaller room used for sleeping and storage. And at the back, the kitchen, which is often partly open to the sky, with a grinding stone, a bread oven, and a cellar dug into the floor for grain, and a staircase going up to the roof. 4 rooms. No doors between them, no corridors. To get to the back of the house, you walk through everybody. Now put 8 to 12 people in there. Parents, children, an elderly relative, sometimes a servant, sometimes an unmarried sibling. Now add the heat. Thebes in summer regularly clears 45 degrees Celsius, which is about 113 Fahrenheit, and mud brick holds that heat like a brick oven, because that is functionally what it is. So nobody slept downstairs in summer. They slept on the roof. The entire village slept on the roof, which means every night for months at a time you lay down on a flat mud roof under an unbelievable sky, and so did everyone you had ever met, about 2 meters away, on the roof next to yours. You could hear your neighbors breathing. You could hear them arguing. You could hear absolutely everything else too. There is no version of this where anyone is confused about what anyone else is doing. Let's talk about bodies, because this is where modern people get squeamish, and the Egyptians simply did not. There were no bathrooms in these houses. Not a euphemism, not a primitive version, none. For ordinary Egyptians, the answer was a pot, or the desert, or the edge of the fields. And everyone knew which one you were heading for and roughly why. Washing happened in the river, or in the canals, or from a jar in the courtyard, in full view, as a normal daily activity. Egyptian art is not shy about this. Children are routinely depicted completely naked until puberty. Laborers, fishermen, and dancers are depicted in loincloths or in nothing at all. Nudity in Egypt was not scandalous. It was contextual, and it mostly correlated with heat, water, and class. The people wearing the most clothing were the people who did the least work, which is a pattern that repeats across roughly all of human history and has never once been subtle about it. Which brings us to the strangest object in the entire village. In the front room of many Deir el-Medina houses, archaeologists found the remains of a raised enclosed brick platform, waist height, boxed in on 3 sides, with a little set of steps going up to it. Egyptologists call it the lit close, the enclosed bed. And the decoration on the surviving examples is remarkably consistent. Bes, the dwarf god with the lion's face, protector of households and childbirth. Taweret, the pregnant hippopotamus goddess, also childbirth. Images of women with children, women at their toilette, convolvulus vines. And here's where I have to be honest with you, because this channel does not fake certainty. We genuinely do not know what it was for. The leading interpretations are that it was a birthing bed, or a shrine for the household cult, or a marital bed, or a space used during the period after childbirth when a mother was ritually secluded. Some scholars think it's all of those at different times, which is how objects in real houses usually work. But sit with the possibility for a second. The single most protected, decorated, deliberately enclosed space in the entire house may have been the one place where a woman got to be temporarily separate from everyone else. Not a bedroom, a box, with steps, in the front room, where you walk in. And that might have been the closest thing to a private room that an ordinary person in this village ever had access to in their whole life. Now let's do marriage, which is genuinely one of my favorite facts about ancient Egypt because it deletes about 4,000 years of assumptions. There is no evidence of an ancient Egyptian wedding ceremony. None. No temple ritual, no officiant, no vows, no recorded religious rite for getting married. The phrase used in the texts is essentially about establishing a household, or entering a house. You moved in together. That was it. That was the wedding. And divorce worked on the same logic. You left. One party moved out, and the marriage was over. What did exist in enormous quantity were property contracts. Documents specifying what each person brought into the household, what they were owed if it ended, what the woman kept, what support she received. Egyptian women could own property, initiate divorce, testify in court, and sue. So the paperwork wasn't about romance, it was about assets, which is arguably the most clear-eyed take on marriage anyone has ever had. But notice what's missing. If the ceremony is moving in and the divorce is moving out, then your entire marital status is a matter of public observation. The village didn't need a registry. The village had windows. Everyone knew because everyone could see the door you walked through at night. Okay, let's talk about what happened when it went wrong, because this is where the total absence of privacy stops being a lifestyle detail and becomes a weapon. In the British Museum, there is a piece of limestone catalogued as Ostrakhan 5634 from the reign of Rameses II. It is a work register. It lists 40-odd men from the crew, and it records day by day who did not show up and why. And the reasons are the most human documents ever committed to stone. Men were absent because they were brewing beer, because they were ill, because they had been stung by a scorpion, because they were embalming a relative, because they were building their own house, because they had a fight with their wife, because a woman in their household was menstruating and they were required to be at home. Let that sit for a second. 3,200 years ago, a foreman with a limestone flake and a reed brush wrote down that a man named Penub couldn't come to work because of a domestic argument, and then he threw the flake in a pit, and you just found out about it. Penub had no idea. Penub thought that was between him and his wife. And it wasn't just attendance. The village had a court made up of the villagers themselves, and it handled everything from unpaid loans to theft to accusations of adultery, in public, out loud, in front of the neighbors who were both the jury and the audience. And when human judgment wasn't enough, they asked a god. Deir el-Medina had its own local deity, the deified pharaoh Amenhotep I, who had been dead for centuries and had a much more active social life than most living people. On festival days, priests carried his statue through the village in procession, and you could ask it questions. You would submit a question, often written on a flake of limestone, phrased so it could be answered yes or no. Sometimes 2 flakes, one for each answer, placed on the ground. And the statue, carried on the shoulders of the bearers, would move. Forward for yes, backward for no, or it would incline toward one of the flakes. And that was the verdict. Now think about the kind of questions people asked. Is it he who stole the tool? Should I take this donkey? Is this land mine? Is this man the thief? You are standing in the street, in front of the entire village, publicly accusing your neighbor by name and asking a wooden statue of a dead king to settle it in front of everyone. There is no version of that dispute that stays between the two of you. The trial, the accusation, the evidence, and the verdict are a street event. And your neighbors will remember it for the rest of your life because they are going to be sleeping 2 meters from you on the roof tonight. Which brings us to Peneb. Peneb was a chief workman at Deir el-Medina during the late 19th dynasty, and he is the reason we know that ancient gossip had a filing system. There is a document now in the British Museum known as Papyrus Salt 124. It was written by a man named Amenhotep, and it is in its entirety a formal list of accusations against Peneb. And it is a list. Amenhotep accuses Peneb of stealing stone from a royal tomb to build his own, of stealing tools, of taking a chisel meant for the king's tomb and using it on his own, of violence, of threatening to kill people, of intimidating the crew, and then, in the most devastatingly specific section, of adultery, with several named women in the village whose husbands are also named. Their names are in the document, their names are in a museum, their names are in this video. Now, the honest caveat, and it matters. Amenhotep had a motive. He appears to have believed the chief workman position should have gone to him. So Papyrus Salt 124 is not a neutral police report. It is an accusation written by a rival. And we do not know how much of it is true. But that is somehow worse, not better. Because whether or not Peneb did any of it, the mechanism worked perfectly. One angry man with a papyrus roll and a good memory for who went into whose house could put his neighbor's sex life into the permanent record of human civilization. And he did, and it's still there. And before we go further, let's stop and notice who is missing from all of this. Because everything I've described is a village with no privacy. But privacy did exist in Egypt. It just cost money. Go back a few centuries and about 500 kilometers north to a place called Kahun, near modern El Lahun. It's a planned town built around 1895 BCE to house the workforce and administration for the Pyramid of Senusret II, built all at once, on a grid, by the state. And when archaeologists mapped it, they found something that should be printed on the cover of every book about ancient inequality. There's a wall through the middle of the town. On one side, rows of small workers' houses, packed tight, a handful of rooms each. On the other side, a small number of enormous mansions, not slightly bigger. Some of these elite houses are dozens of times the size of the workers' units. Multiple courtyards, columned halls, granaries, dedicated quarters for servants, room after room after room, and the wall exists to keep those two experiences of the same town separate. Then look at Amarna, the city Akhenaten built from nothing in the 14th century BCE and abandoned almost immediately, which makes it a perfectly preserved snapshot of a single moment. The elite villas at Amarna have enclosure walls. They have private wells, so you don't have to queue at a public water source with everyone else in your neighborhood. They have gardens and porches and separate suites of rooms for the head of the household. They have small chambers with a stone or brick washing slab and a drainage channel running out through the wall. And several have a limestone toilet seat, a shaped block set over a removable container of sand, in a small room set aside for exactly that. A room, with a door, for that. So let's be extremely clear about what privacy actually is. It is not a human instinct that ancient people hadn't developed yet. It is square footage. It is a wall, a well, and enough surplus to build a room whose only job is to hold one person doing one thing. Privacy is one of the oldest luxury goods on Earth, and the people who couldn't afford it were being watched by the people who could. Now here's the twist, and it's the part that changes what this whole video is actually about. Everything I have told you about these people, the arguments, the scandals, the hangovers, the sick days, the accusations, exists for one reason. They wrote on garbage. Papyrus was expensive. It was a manufactured product, and you didn't waste it on a shopping list. So for everyday writing, Egyptians used ostraca, flakes of limestone that fell off the cliffs by the thousand, and broken bits of pottery. Free. Everywhere. Disposable. And at Deir el-Medina, a village full of literate craftsmen surrounded by limestone, people wrote on these constantly. Work rosters. I owe us. Laundry accounts. Letters to their mothers. Sketches. Doodles. Caricatures of their bosses. Love poems. Practice drawings for tomb paintings. Medical notes. Legal complaints. Drawings that I am not going to describe in detail, but which make it very clear that the artists of Deir el-Medina had a rich interior life and a lot of spare limestone, and when they were done, they threw them away. Just outside the village there is a huge pit. It was originally dug as an attempt to reach groundwater, went down a staggering distance, never hit water, and was abandoned. So the village used it as a rubbish dump for generations. And in that pit, along with the surrounding refuse heaps, archaeologists have recovered tens of thousands of ostraca. The number is genuinely absurd. The garbage is the archive. Everything we know about the intimate lives of these people, we know because they lived in a place too dry for their trash to decay, too walled for it to blow away, and too literate to stay quiet. And now do the thing I've been building toward. These people had no privacy from their neighbors. That's the video's title, but that's not actually the ending. Because their lack of privacy did not stop at the village wall or at their own lifetimes. Pennub did not consent to you knowing he had a fight with his wife. The women named in Papyrus Salt 124 did not consent to being named. The man who scribbled a rude drawing of his supervisor on a rock and chucked it in a pit was not filing it for posterity. He was throwing it away. And 3,000 years later, a stranger from a civilization he could not have imagined picked it out of the dirt with a brush, gave it a catalog number, and published it. They are the most thoroughly known ordinary people of the ancient world, and every single one of them is famous by accident, against their will, forever. The total absence of privacy is the only reason they aren't a blank. Every other village of that period is silent. Not because those people had less interesting lives, but because nothing they said survived. Deir el-Medina talks because Deir el-Medina couldn't shut up, couldn't afford paper, and couldn't compost. Let's take a step back and look at the full picture, because there are three things here, and they stack. First, privacy is architecture. Not a value, not a right, not an instinct. A physical arrangement of walls, and it either exists in your building or it doesn't. Change the floor plan and you change what a person is capable of hiding, which means you change what a person is. Second, architecture is money. The wall at Kahun, the private well at Amarna, the limestone toilet seat in its own small room. Privacy has been for sale for 4,000 years, and the price has always been the same, which is more space than you strictly need. The workman's house has 4 rooms, and every one of them is doing a job. The villa has 30, and several of them are doing nothing but keeping people out. And third, the thing they had instead of privacy was witness. This is the part I keep coming back to, because we talk about the absence of privacy as pure loss, and for the people in that village, a lot of it genuinely was. You could be accused in the street. Your marriage could end up in a museum. Your worst night could be recorded by a foreman with a rock. But run it the other way. Nobody in that village died alone in a room and went unnoticed for 9 days. Nobody had a crisis that the people around them somehow failed to detect. Nobody had to explain their circumstances to a neighbor because the neighbor had been standing right there for the entire thing. When their child was born, the whole street heard it. When someone was struggling, it was not possible to hide it. and that cuts in both directions with enormous force. We bought the door, it was a real purchase, and we got real things for it, and I am not remotely suggesting you give yours back. But you did pay for it, and what you paid was being witnessed. Tonight, when you close that door, notice it for a second. That door is younger than the pyramids, younger than writing, younger than the wheel, and for almost every human being who has ever drawn breath, it simply was not an option. The man on the roof at Deir el-Medina, 3,200 years ago, lying on a mat in the dark with his family 2 meters away, and the entire village breathing all around him, could look up and see the same sky you can, and he could not close a single door between himself and another human being for his whole life. He never got 20 minutes where nobody could see his face. He also never had to wonder whether anyone would notice if he didn't come home. We know his neighbor had a hangover, we know his foreman wrote it down, we know his colleague slept with someone else's wife, and that a man with a grudge made a list. We know all of it because none of them were ever alone. They were the last people on Earth to be completely visible, and we are the strangers still watching, and they have no idea, and they never will. So here's my question for you. Could you do it 1 month at Deir el-Medina? No doors, no rooms, no bathroom, and everything you do written on a rock by somebody who doesn't like you. Let me know in the comments. Until then, see you soon.